Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive thanks to President Trump's trade war and specifically the steel and aluminum tariffs.
A single policy decision quietly triggered a chain reaction that sent shockwaves through North American manufacturing, raised prices for American consumers, and exposed just how vulnerable the United States has become in this trade war with Canada. Washington imposed aluminum tariffs at a level that stunned global markets. The move was presented as a forceful defense of American industry, a signal that the United States was prepared to use trade pressure to reshape supply chains and reassert control. Instead, it revealed something far more troubling. The North American aluminum system is not a simple buyer-seller relationship. It is a tightly woven network built over decades, where disruption in one place ripples instantly across borders. Canada is not a marginal supplier. It is the backbone of foreign aluminum feeding United States auto plants, construction projects, packaging lines, and defense manufacturing. When tariffs were raised, the shock did not stay contained. Losses mounted, supply routes shifted, and costs began moving in directions Washington did not anticipate. This was not a dramatic collapse. It was more dangerous than that. It was a slow, structural reversal where leverage quietly changed hands. And by the time prices adjusted, the question was no longer whether the trade war was hurting Canada. The real question was who inside the United States would ultimately pay the bill. The escalation came faster than policymakers in Washington appeared to expect. Within days of the aluminum tariffs taking effect, the consequences began surfacing across the supply chain, revealing how little room there was for shock absorption in a system already operating on tight margins. Canadian aluminum producers were the first to feel the impact. Market prices did not immediately adjust to the new tariff level, forcing exporters to sell into the United States at a loss. According to industry estimates, losses mounted rapidly, reaching roughly 600 million United States dollars in a short span of time. This was not a manageable fluctuation. It was a signal that the tariff structure was economically unsustainable. What followed marked the true turning point of this trade war. Rather than absorb continued losses or rush to political concessions, Canadian producers changed course. Nearly half of the aluminum that would normally flow south was withheld or redirected. Some shipments stayed inside Canada. Others were rerouted across the Atlantic to European markets where pricing, while imperfect, remained economically viable. This was the moment Washington lost leverage. Tariffs are most effective when the target has no alternative. In this case, Canada did. Decades of infrastructure investment had placed most Canadian aluminum smelters near deep water ports. These facilities were designed for global trade, not dependence on a single buyer. Europe was not an emergency option. It was an existing outlet that simply became more attractive overnight. For the United States, the immediate impact was subtle but severe. Manufacturers relying on Canadian aluminum began facing tighter supply and rising procurement costs. Contracts were renegotiated. Delivery timelines shifted. The tariff did not strengthen domestic capacity at scale. Instead, it reduced flexibility for American buyers at the exact moment they needed it most. This is where the trade war narrative began to fracture. The policy was framed as pressure on Canada, but the first systemic strain appeared inside the United States economy itself. The costs did not vanish. They moved quietly and methodically toward downstream industries and eventually toward consumers. And as this adjustment unfolded, an even more consequential shift was taking place behind the scenes, one that would reshape long-term trade dynamics between the United States and Canada in ways that Washington did not publicly acknowledge. Listen carefully, because the next phase reveals how this tariff shock turned into a strategic lesson that could outlast the trade war itself. As the aluminum tariffs settled into place, a critical reality became impossible to ignore. Tariffs do not eliminate costs, they relocate them. And in this case, the relocation happened almost entirely inside the United States economy. For American manufacturers, the effect was immediate. Aluminum is not a niche input. It is a foundational material used across automotive production, residential and commercial construction, food and beverage packaging, energy infrastructure, and defense manufacturing. When Canadian aluminum shipments slowed and prices adjusted upward to reflect the full tariff burden, procurement costs rose across the board. Manufacturers faced an unpalatable set of choices: absorb the higher costs and accept thinner margins, attempt to renegotiate long-term supply contracts, or pass the costs downstream. In most cases, some combination of all three occurred. This is how tariffs quietly become inflationary pressure. Small and mid-sized manufacturers were particularly exposed. Unlike multinational corporations, they lacked the scale to quickly diversify suppliers or hedge against price volatility. For many, aluminum costs represent a significant share of total input expenses. Even modest price increases translated into reduced hiring, delayed capital investment, or price increases for finished goods. The automotive sector illustrates the dynamic clearly. Aluminum-intensive components are used to reduce vehicle weight and meet efficiency standards. When input costs rise, manufacturers do not simply reverse design choices. Instead, they adjust pricing. The result is higher sticker prices for consumers, already strained by elevated borrowing costs and broader inflation. Construction followed a similar pattern. Aluminum framing, siding, and structural components became more expensive. Contractors faced rising bids. Developers delayed projects. Home renovation costs climbed further out of reach for many households. By late summer, the aluminum tariff was functioning less like a trade defense tool and more like a hidden surcharge embedded throughout the United States economy. The policy did not appear on a tax bill, but it showed up in vehicle prices, housing costs, and consumer goods. This is where public perception and economic reality began to diverge. The tariff was marketed as a measure to protect American industry. In practice, it imposed a diffuse cost on American consumers, one that was difficult to trace but impossible to avoid. And as pressure built within the United States, Canada was moving in a very different direction. While American manufacturers struggled to absorb higher costs, Canadian aluminum producers were executing a disciplined adjustment strategy. The initial losses were painful, but they were temporary. Once shipments to the United States slowed, global markets began to rebalance. European buyers increased intake, pricing stabilized, Canadian producers shifted volumes without dismantling existing relationships with United States customers. Crucially, they avoided prolonged exposure to unprofitable trade flows. This preserved balance sheets and protected employment in a sector that supports thousands of Canadian workers directly and indirectly. From a strategic standpoint, the outcome was significant. Canada did not retreat from the United States market, but it reduced its vulnerability to sudden policy shocks. The aluminum episode reinforced a broader lesson already taking shape across Canadian trade policy. Over-reliance on a single market carries political risk, regardless of historical ties. This recalibration was not ideological. It was pragmatic. The United States remains geographically attractive and commercially important, but the trade war demonstrated that access can no longer be assumed to be stable. Canada responded by strengthening optionality rather than confrontation. In doing so, Canada quietly improved its negotiating position. Future tariff threats lost some of their force. The message was clear, even if it was never stated outright. Canada could withstand pressure without collapsing supply chains or sacrificing long-term competitiveness. For the United States, this shift should have raised alarms. Trade leverage depends on asymmetry. When that asymmetry erodes, tariffs lose their coercive power. And yet, the broader implications of this change went largely unnoticed in public debate. The focus remained on short-term trade headlines, not on the deeper transformation unfolding beneath them. Because the aluminum tariff was not an isolated incident. It was a signal. And in the next section, that signal expands beyond metals into a larger question about how trade wars reshape alliances, influence global perceptions, and ultimately redefine who holds power in the international economic system. Stay with this analysis to the end, because the next phase exposes a strategic consequence that Washington did not anticipate, and it may carry far greater consequences than higher aluminum prices alone. From the perspective of policymakers in Washington, the aluminum tariffs were designed to project resolve. The logic was straightforward. Raise costs for foreign suppliers, create breathing room for domestic producers, and force trading partners to reconsider their positions. In theory, tariffs would strengthen the United States' hand in a widening trade war. In practice, the results exposed structural limits. The United States aluminum sector has not rebuilt capacity at the scale required to replace Canadian supply. Smelter construction is capital-intensive, energy-dependent, and slow. Even with tariff protection, domestic producers could not rapidly expand output without long-term certainty on energy prices, regulatory stability, and demand. Tariffs alone do not solve those constraints. What they did do was raise costs for downstream industries that employ far more Americans than primary aluminum production itself. For every job inside a smelter, there are many more tied to fabrication, transportation, automotive manufacturing, construction, and packaging. When aluminum prices rise, these sectors feel the pressure first. This created a policy contradiction. The tariffs were justified as a tool to protect American workers, yet they increased operating costs for industries employing hundreds of thousands of people across the United States. The benefits were concentrated, the costs were broad. Inside Washington, this tension did not disappear. It shifted. Trade officials emphasized national security and supply independence, while manufacturers quietly warned about margin erosion and competitiveness. Lobbying intensified, not from foreign governments, but from American businesses caught between policy objectives and economic reality. More importantly, the tariffs did not produce the intended negotiating leverage over Canada. Instead of concessions, they triggered diversification. Once Canada demonstrated it could redirect supply at scale, the threat value of future tariffs declined. Leverage depends on dependency, and dependency had just been reduced. For the United States, this represented a strategic setback that was easy to overlook. There was no dramatic retaliation, no formal escalation, just a gradual erosion of influence. And outside Washington, other capitals were watching closely. Beyond North America, the aluminum tariff episode resonated far beyond the metal itself. European markets absorbed redirected Canadian supply with relative ease. This was not simply a matter of price. It was a signal of reliability. For European buyers, Canada appeared as a stable supplier capable of adjusting under pressure without politicizing trade relationships. In contrast, the United States appeared increasingly willing to weaponize access even against long-standing partners. In a global economy shaped by uncertainty, predictability carries value. This perception matters. Trade wars do not occur in isolation. They shape how allies plan supply chains, where companies invest, and which markets are treated as dependable over the long term. When tariffs are applied abruptly, partners begin to ask whether exposure to the United States carries hidden risk. The aluminum case reinforced an uncomfortable narrative. The United States remains a critical market, but it is no longer assumed to be a neutral one. Policy volatility has become part of the cost calculation. For Canada, this environment created opportunity. By maintaining commercial discipline and avoiding escalation, it positioned itself as a supplier that adapts rather than retaliates. That distinction matters to global buyers seeking continuity rather than confrontation. For the United States, the reputational cost is harder to quantify, but no less real. Influence in global trade has always rested not only on market size, but on trust. When partners believe access can be restricted without warning, they invest in alternatives. Over time, those alternatives become permanent. This is how trade wars quietly reshape alliances. Not through headlines, but through procurement decisions, infrastructure, investment, and long-term contracts that bypass uncertainty And this brings us to the most consequential question of all. If tariffs accelerate diversification away from the United States, what happens when multiple sectors follow the same path as aluminum? Listen to the final section carefully, because it explores a strategic risk that goes far beyond metals, one that could redefine how power is exercised in the global trading system, and whether the United States is strengthening its position or slowly pricing itself out of influence. The aluminum tariffs did more than disrupt short-term trade flows. They accelerated a strategic shift that had been developing quietly inside Canada for years. The lesson was clear and difficult to ignore. In a trade war environment, resilience does not come from proximity or history. It comes from options. For decades, Canada benefited from seamless access to the United States market. Geography, infrastructure, and political alignment made that access feel permanent. The aluminum shock challenged that assumption. When tariffs rose without warning, Canada was forced to test whether its diversification strategy was real or merely theoretical. The result was decisive. Canada did not need to abandon the United States to protect itself. It only needed to prove that the United States was no longer the only viable destination. By redirecting aluminum to Europe and sustaining production without long-term losses, Canada demonstrated strategic independence without confrontation. This matters beyond aluminum. Once a country proves it can adapt under pressure, future threats lose potency. Tariffs rely on asymmetry. When that asymmetry collapses, leverage follows. Canada's position after the aluminum episode is stronger, not weaker. It remains integrated with the United States, but it is no longer exposed in the same way. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It does not generate headlines, yet it changes the balance of future negotiations across energy, critical minerals, manufacturing inputs, and advanced materials. In trade war terms, Canada did not win by overpowering the United States. It won by removing the ability to be cornered. And this strategic recalibration did not go unnoticed. For the United States, the aluminum episode raised uncomfortable questions about the long-term effectiveness of tariffs in a globalized economy. Tariffs can raise prices quickly. What they struggle to do is rebuild complex industrial ecosystems on their own. Domestic aluminum capacity did not surge. Investment decisions remained constrained by energy costs, regulatory timelines, and uncertainty over whether tariff protection would last. Meanwhile, downstream industries absorbed higher costs almost immediately. This highlights a deeper strategic risk. When tariffs are used repeatedly, partners adapt, supply chains evolve, new routes become permanent. Over time, the United States risks turning a temporary pressure tactic into a catalyst for long-term diversification away from its own market. This is not theoretical. Aluminum is a foundational input. If similar dynamics unfold in other sectors, the cumulative effect could be significant. Each trade war episode chips away at assumed centrality. Each disruption encourages alternatives. The danger is not collapse, it is marginalization. The United States remains one of the largest consumer markets in the world. But influence in global trade is not measured only by size. It is measured by predictability. When access becomes conditional and volatile, market participants begin to treat the United States as a high-risk node rather than a stable anchor. That shift does not happen overnight. It happens quietly, contract by contract, investment by investment, and by the time it becomes visible in trade data, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. This is the paradox of modern tariffs. They feel powerful in the moment, yet they can weaken the very leverage they are meant to create. And that brings us to the final reckoning. Because the aluminum tariffs were not just about metal, they were a test case, a warning signal. A glimpse into how trade wars now function in a world where supply chains are global, flexible, and increasingly unwilling to be coerced. Listen to the conclusion carefully, because it draws together the economic, political, and strategic threads of this story and asks a question that goes directly to the future of trade policy in the United States. The answer may be more unsettling than the tariff itself. The aluminum tariffs were introduced as a show of strength. They were meant to signal, resolve, protect domestic industry, and remind trading partners that the United States was willing to use tariffs as a blunt instrument in an escalating trade war. What they ultimately revealed was something far more sobering. Canada did not collapse under pressure. It absorbed short-term pain, redirected supply, and emerged with greater strategic flexibility. European markets adjusted, Canadian producers stabilized. And the United States economy quietly absorbed higher costs through manufacturers, contractors, and consumers. No dramatic retaliation followed. No public surrender took place. Instead, the outcome unfolded in balance sheets, procurement contracts, and price tags. This is what a modern trade war looks like. The damage is not always visible at first glance, but it is persistent and cumulative. For the United States, the aluminum episode raises a fundamental question about the future of trade policy. Can tariffs still deliver leverage in a world where supply chains are global and alternatives exist? Or do they accelerate the very diversification that weakens long-term influence? This was not just a dispute over metal. It was a warning about power in the global economy and how quickly it can shift when assumptions go unchallenged. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States? Subscribe for more fact-based global trade analysis. And reflect on this carefully, because the next trade conflict may already be forming and the consequences could be even more difficult to reverse.